Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Jim Glaser. I'm the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences here at Tufts. I'm also a professor of political science. And I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for today's program. Today, we'll have a conversation with Dr. Steve Cicala, which is a part of the Force for Good webinar series, which highlights the positive impact that our faculty and research being done at the university are having during these unprecedented times. Before I introduce Professor Cicala and tell you about his very impressive background, I'd like to give you a brief update on the School of Arts and Sciences. I am just so impressed by our students, faculty, and staff, but never more than in this year that we're now in. Here on campus, we have been very fortunate to have roughly 85% of our students on campus for the fall semester. Here we are at the very end of week 10, and we have kept our students safe and been able to establish a bubble and keep that bubble intact for the most part. It's not to say that the upcoming weeks won't pose a challenge for us, but I think it's fair to say that over the first 10 weeks of the semester, we've been very successful. We also have established a partnership with Beijing Normal University in China, which has enabled about 75 students, Chinese students who were unable to make it to the United States because of visa challenges, to stay in China, but also to have a residential experience in Beijing Normal. Our partner institution in China was gracious enough to allow our students to live on their campus and to eat on their campus and to live on their campus and to study there while piping into courses here. So we're really pleased to have had that partnership and to have those students participate in the semester and have an on-campus experience, but not on this campus. Since August 3rd, we have conducted over 150,000 COVID-19 tests. We are testing students twice a week and faculty and staff once a week. I was tested this very morning. The overall positivity rate has been 0.04 over all 4 of our campuses. The 7-day positivity rate is 0.06%, which is much lower than the state of Massachusetts. I had a faculty member say in a meeting that I'm just coming from that the Tufts campus is the safest spot in Massachusetts. I mean, really the reason has been, and the reason is I've said we've been able to establish and keep our bubble intact, is that our students have done an outstanding job keeping the community safe and following the protocols, the many and significant protocols that were established by our health advisors and by the president, by President Monaco. We have had another big effort that's been underway for the past 6 months. It really is something that's been underway for a long time at Tufts, but the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and the commitment to Tufts becoming an anti-racist institution are efforts that have really gained a lot of momentum in the university. In the School of Arts and Sciences, we've had a multi-pronged approach to this challenge, which includes an effort to further diversify our curriculum, to further diversify our faculty, staff, and students, to encourage and facilitate conversations about diversity across departments and units, to train faculty in inclusive teaching strategies, and to increase financial aid and other support for our first generation students. And finally, I just want to say I've been very impressed by our alumni, our parents, our friends, for all they've done to help support Tufts through these challenging times, supporting our efforts, our anti-racist efforts, supporting our COVID efforts, and just being there with us through this really extraordinary moment. One of the real joys of being a dean is that I supervise the hiring of faculty. I am a competitive person, and I really enjoy competing for the services of the best people on the market. And when we were successful in hiring our enormously talented new colleague in economics last year, we had a big celebration in the dean's office. I don't think he knows that, but I would say that the deans celebrate every hire, and particularly a high impact hire, which we perceived that we had done last year. Steve Cicala has been an incredible addition to our economics department. It's an important department for us. They serve an enormous number of students. They host one of our strongest Ph.D. programs, a program that we're partnering with the Fletcher School on, and it's a center of high quality research and scholarship. And so it is now my pleasure to introduce that new colleague to you, Assistant Professor Steve Cicala. Steve is a Neubauer faculty fellow and received his bachelor degree in economics from the University of Chicago and his PhD in economics from Harvard University. Most recently, Steve taught for several years in the University of Chicago's Harris School of Public Policy. Outside of Tufts, he's affiliated with organizations such as the Harvard Environmental Economics Program, the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, the International Growth Center, and the National Bureau of Economic Research. He has an outstanding scholarly record, and he's published in the best journals in the discipline, and the department is very excited about what he will be bringing to the classroom. We're confident that we have secured a fantastic Tufts teacher scholar. A couple of housekeeping things before we start. This webinar will be recorded and uploaded to our Tufts alumni YouTube channel. You will notice your audio and video are disabled, but we'd like to encourage your questions. So if you could please submit your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will see all of those, and after I ask Steve a handful of questions, then we will move to the questions coming from you. So Steve, welcome to Tufts. We've met a few times on Zoom. We've not yet met in person, but you must know how happy we are to have you here.
Yes, thank you very much for having me.
I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background, you know, and a little bit about your path, how you found your way into economics, and how you chose the particular specialty that you've embraced.
Yeah, so I'm from the Hudson Valley in New York. I have, since growing up, bounced back and forth between Chicago and the East Coast a few times from undergrad, as you mentioned, in Chicago, then back to the East Coast for my PhD, and then back to Chicago. And so it's great to be back on the East Coast again. In terms of how I found my way into economics, as an undergraduate, I was actually really interested in philosophy, and had been studying philosophy for a few years, taking a lot of philosophy coursework, and thought, you know, I was at the University of Chicago, it'd be a shame to spend all that time there and not have taken an economics class. And I really fell in love with the idea of an intersection between philosophy and economics, and started studying that. And what really, you know, drew me into research in economics was an economist named Gary Becker, who I met and began working with while I was at the University of Chicago. He's a Nobel laureate, one of the great economists of the 20th century. And it was really from working with him that I became an economist. Yeah.
And how about the sort of particular brand of economics that you've taken on?
Yeah, so I typically focus on energy and environmental economics. I have found it to be an incredibly fertile subfield for studying regulation, which is one of the more sort of big picture questions that I'm interested in that it has just a lot of settings in which it's really important. It really affects people's welfare, their health, their economic well-being, depends on sort of how we use the resources of the environment and environmental quality more generally. It also tends to be a setting in which there's very good data. And as someone who does a lot of empirical work, it's very important to, if you're going to try to test a hypothesis, to have very good data to do it. And so that sort of combination of different forces has made me excited about working in energy and environmental topics.
Yes, that's interesting that you say you're an empirical economist. Does your philosophy background ever enter into your work?
I think it has helped for, I think, staying grounded to thinking about the question and staying focused on the sort of like, what's the important thing here? So not so much involved in the day-to-day work, but I think over the long arc of it, it has been helpful as sort of an organizing principle.
That's really interesting. You've been at Tufts for a few months. I realize that it's mostly been through Zoom, but I just wonder if you have any first impressions of the university.
Sure. It has been an unusual way to start a new job and to be introduced to a new community. But I mean, at least remotely, the department, the economics department, I had visited a couple of times previously, physically, when that was possible. And aside from being just an excellent group of scholars, they're also incredibly collegial. And so that combination of having really talented colleagues who are also just really nice to be around, who you want to participate in conversations with, is a really wonderful combination. I've been teaching remotely this fall. That has, I think, also really highlighted just how resilient the students have been. I'm teaching a statistics class, which is already not the easiest material to be absorbing. Doing it in a remote setting is even sort of trickier. And so I've really been impressed with how the students have hung in there and really applied themselves this semester.
Great. Well, I've been here for 30 years. It'll be 30 years in January, and the students never cease to impress me. It's the great joy of being here. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your research and scholarship, and perhaps starting with the work that you've done on electricity markets.
Sure. Sort of going back to your question about, what has been the role of philosophy in the work that I do. The sort of big picture for the work that I've done on electricity markets is about the role of government regulating economic activity. And this is a debate that has gone on for centuries, really, and tends to follow a kind of pendulum pattern in its exact implementation. Are we sort of in a mood for deregulating things because we think that the government is wasteful and inefficient and that kind of thing? And then we've done those things, and then we realize that there was a reason that there was some regulation there in the first place, that, going unchecked, firms can exert market power. There can be all kinds of those types of issues. And so there tends to be this sort of back and forth nirvana fallacy where we think, well, if only we went to the other side, we would fix all of these problems, not keeping in mind that really neither one of these systems are perfect. And so from that kind of bigger question, I've found that studying electricity markets has actually been a really cool way of trying to contribute to that debate. Because in the United States, the electricity sector has historically been regulated. It has had vertically integrated utilities where state regulators set the price of electricity, and the utilities they consider themselves in the electricity making business, right? They own the power plants, they own the transmission lines, and they serve their own customers. which means that there isn't necessarily a ton of coordination across different service areas. You have your own customers and you can charge your price for them. And the utilities would sort of coordinate the way that neighbors would trade a cup of sugar. They would level up at the end of the month. But in terms of, really seeking out the most efficient producers across, large areas, it's not how our grid was built. It's not what it was built for. And so the main change over the past 25 years has been the introduction of wholesale electricity markets, where instead of me running my plants to serve my customers, the lights in New England, for example, and in fact now 60% of the United States, are kept on as the result of auction outcomes. That power plants and the managers of those power plants bid into auctions to produce electricity, and only the plants that bid economically are actually called on to operate. And so this is a completely different way of organizing an industry. It has some problems associated with it, of issues of market power and trying to manipulate the auctions in order to make more money, that sort of thing. And so again, it gets back to this sort of, neither one of these are going to be perfect. We want to know what happens on net. And so I've collected 14 years of data from the hourly operations of every power plant in the country, the amount of electricity being taken off the grid at an hourly level for 14 years, just an absolutely massive amount of data, in order to calculate how has the cost of keeping the lights on changed as areas started to use markets to keep the lights on instead of just regulated engineers. And so even though, the markets themselves are imperfect, the bottom line, the finding was that it's helped reduce costs by a few $1 billion a year in the United States, in just the parts of the country that are using these markets.
So you have a strain of research there. What are you working on now? How does it follow from your previous work?
Yeah, when I was first putting the electricity data together, one of the striking things that really jumped out, just as you make a first figure, is the way that electricity consumption fell during the Great Recession. Many people will remember that sort of, I guess, it's going to be 12 years ago, right about now, we were effectively in free fall. We were trying to figure out how large the stimulus package should be after the financial crisis. We didn't know what the situation in the labor market actually was, because all of those indicators are reported with a lag. It takes months to pull together the data to find out what is actually happening with unemployment, what is happening with GDP. And so when you have a fast-moving crisis as a policymaker, you're trying to respond to something that you don't really know is actually happening at the moment. So it really jumped out in the electricity data that you could see that the economy was in free fall effectively in real time. And so no one had been working with that data at the time to sort of make this point. And so I sort of noted that, said, boy, that'd be really interesting to do something about that someday. And then we had 12 gloriously boring macroeconomic years. And so it sort of went on the back burner while I was working through these other projects. And so when COVID struck, it sort of had a very similar feel to it, of just what is happening in the economy right now. There are a lot of people who need help. But we don't know what the unemployment situation is. And so sort of pulled out this old data and the old code that I had to pull data, and have been collecting electricity data to estimate effectively sort of real-time indices of economic activity as we can see what's happening on the electricity grid. And so during the early shutdowns in April, for example, the United States was consuming about 8% less electricity than it normally would, which is worse than the depths of the Great Recession at the time. And so we've been sort of tracking that and building that out over the course of the summer. been busy time.
Um, wow. So as we think about COVID-19, you've started to move in this direction, and how it's affected our lives. What insights do you have on how changes in society have influenced economic activity?
Yeah. Uh, so one of the things as I've been analyzing this data that really jumped out was that there was a very large increase in electricity consumption, almost made the US look like things were back to normal over the summertime in a way that contrasted with Europe that had a much slower and gradual recovery. And it turns out, well, the United States has a lot more air conditioning than Europe does. And even adjusting for temperatures, the fact that people were staying at home more meant that they were consuming even more electricity than normal. That it takes more electricity to cool everyone individually in their own homes than it does when we've all congregated in offices and schools and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing that has really jumped out is the way that on one hand, residential electricity consumption has increased quite a lot in a way that has offset the decline in industrial and commercial electricity. But I was also able to get my hands on some smart meter data, on residential smart meter data that shows me at the hourly level how much electricity people are consuming. And so in terms of how it's affected people's lives, you can really see how the day-to-day of people at home has changed during COVID-19. They would typically have an increase in electricity consumption around 7 or 8 in the morning. They're getting up and making coffee and making breakfast and all these things. And then it would drop off a bit because they would leave the house and go to work and be pretty flat over the course of the day, and then come back again when people come home in the evening. It doesn't look anything like that anymore. First, they're sleeping in a little bit later. So the uptick starts later in the day. It starts more 8 or 9 instead of 7 or 8. And it increases steadily over the course of the day and makes the weekday residential consumption look just like the weekends. And so if you've been going a little crazy in your home thinking another day of this, they're all blending together, you're not alone. It's even visible in the aggregate data of residential electricity consumption. It's just that every day looks like Sunday.
Wow. And what about the fact that so much work is being conducted via computers?
Yeah.
It has to be accounted for somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it's a sort of a combination of, just being at home and using more air conditioning, but also working from home. You're using your computers, you're opening the fridge, you normally wouldn't be there, TV, all of these other things increase residential electricity consumption. And the biggest increases in electricity consumption have occurred in places where the occupational structure of the labor force is such that people can work from home. And so there's sort of measures of, is this a job that could be done from home? And in the places that have more people in jobs that can be done from home, the residential electricity consumption is even higher. It's about $1.5 billion a month in additional residential electricity consumption or expenditures by households.
Wow. As you look forward, as you project forward, what do you think the future of energy usage is around the world?
Yeah, so it's, I think there are a few different forces moving in different directions. One thing that was really striking before COVID was that after the Great Recession, as I described, there was this drop in electricity consumption. And you would expect there would have been a rebound. The economy grew about 24% from the depths of the Great Recession to the end of 2019. But instead of electricity consumption growing, it actually declined in the United States by about 1% a year, a really significant decline in electricity consumption. which is absolutely unprecedented in the history of a modern economy, to have a sustained period of economic growth with reduced electricity consumption. And so, the extent to which the US returns to sort of continued declines, whether this is from LEDs, which use 90% less electricity consumption than a standard incandescent bulb, other efficiencies in appliances or people moving to more temperate areas. There's a sort of whole combination of different forces that would explain this, but at the moment it's unexplained. You set that off against looking abroad, where that decoupling does not exist quite yet in the places where electricity consumption is growing the fastest. In China, in India, places that are developing very rapidly, they're consuming a lot more energy. And so, what the future holds for energy consumption, it's going to depend on, I think, in a lot of ways, the extent to which the most energy efficient technologies diffuse to places that are developing, and sort of trading that off against, well, I mean, as people, as their incomes increase, they're going to want air conditioning, right? They're going to want refrigeration and lighting. And, you really start to get out to rural places where, there are a lot of people who are looking forward to using energy services, and that is going to increase energy consumption.
We have some questions that are coming in from our audience. I'm going to start with one from Rob Stricker, my friend Rob Stricker. He first gives you a welcome to Tufts. He asks, what do you think of MMT and the explosion in the federal deficit and the Fed's balance sheet?
Well, I should be clear that I'm not a macroeconomist. So while I am an economist and have studied macro, it's not my area of specialty. I've followed the MMT debate from afar, enough to sort of gauge if there's been any resolution to it yet. And I think the frustration of a lot of mainstream economists with MMT is that it is very difficult to get the advocates of MMT to formally state what it is. It's very difficult to pin them down in order to have a disciplined debate. In economics, for as much as people would like to say that, it's really a lot of ideological debates, I think one thing that is unifying in economics is a notion of mathematical rigor to writing down a model and solving for the equilibrium of that model and deriving predictions from that model. And so it's been difficult to say, okay, well, what is the model of MMT, and how would that be, how would such a model be consistent with not, just making everything free?
A question from Noel Rimilovsky. In your research, when you analyze migrating from conventional sources of power, such as coal and nuclear, how do you quantify the costs of a weaker grid? For example, in New York City, we get 37% of our power from nuclear. We are anticipating rolling brownouts because other stable sources of power won't pick up the lost load. Brownouts have economic costs, e.g., rolling brownouts resulting from shutting down Indian Point. So folks are buying generators.
Yeah, brownouts are undoubtedly costly. It has been an interesting time to be an energy economist, as we have a grid that is in transition in the way that it is. The growth in renewable sources has been absolutely incredible. And I think, to me at least, one of the main issues isn't so much that we have intermittent sources of power, but a grid that is intermittent, really. The grid makes those sources intermittent, that we don't have a national grid, right? We do not send 3 times as much power as being produced by people in Iowa or Wyoming or in the wind corridor through the middle of the country, or in Arizona and California, places that are very sunny. They are not producing 3 times more power and sending it to places that aren't sunny or aren't windy, right? We have, say, all of our orange juice coming from California and Florida because those places are really good at growing oranges. Instead, we have everyone producing power for themselves. It's a system that doesn't really make sense. It's a bit of a historical vestige for how we've regulated the sector from its infancy. And so I think there will be major changes going forward, just because in order to make economical power, we need a more integrated grid that can accommodate more renewables.
Another question from Rob. Given the long lag in getting traditional economic data to guide policy, have you done any work in using AI to analyze more high frequency data?
Yeah, so I think AI tends to be the coolest new term for running a regression. And so, yeah, I'm running regressions, and I'm using high frequency data to do it. And so the data that I use are hourly measures of electricity consumption from about 100 different zones throughout the country. I have data on meteorological conditions that are pulled from a combination of weather stations and satellites in order to account for, well, how much electricity consumption would we be using during normal times if it's 75 degrees outside or if it's 105 degrees outside. I sort of put all of these things together and do what AI would typically be focusing on, which is a prediction exercise, trying to say, like, what would electricity consumption be? And it turns out you really don't need that complex an algorithm to do that estimation, because the factors that affect energy usage really jump out and explain most of the variation in energy usage that we see.
Eric Warasta writes, thank you for the great discussion. In some power market auctions, the influx of new renewable capacity, such as wind, has resulted in excess supply and in some cases negative power prices. Are the market or policy tools that might be applied to smooth the transition to renewables? I'm sorry, are there market or policy tools that might be applied to smooth the transition to renewables? Are there longer dated futures markets?
Yeah. So this is a great question. This is another sort of fascinating aspect of right now for studying energy, which is, normally you have a good that people are willing to pay for. When you auction it off, it's going to go for a positive price, how much people are willing to pay for that good. Because we don't have a large integrated grid that can send large amounts of power across vast spaces, and we're subsidizing wind generation, wind generators actually bid negative amounts into these auctions. They say, well, my subsidy is $24 a megawatt hour. I'm willing to produce as long as the fine isn't larger than $24 a megawatt hour. And so we often have prices that are $23 a megawatt hour. Minus $23 a megawatt hour. That is to say, they're paying people to take electricity off of the grid because there isn't enough demand. There's a lot of supply, there isn't enough demand. And it's been funny to see the way that policymakers have responded to this, because if you are a nuclear generator right next door, you have all of this wind on your doorstep and the prices are turning negative, and you have a big power plant that you can't just turn on and off. The nuclear plants eat those fines. They're used to making $25 a megawatt hour, and now they're losing it. And so they go to their regulators and say, we don't have enough revenue, we're gonna have to close the plant. the problem is there's, subsidized generation, and they have solved that problem of subsidized generation by subsidizing more generation. And so the nuclear plants get a subsidy so that they can generate too. The problem is too much supply, and they're trying to solve it with more supply. So I think a more natural solution to this is that you have negative prices in localized places because you can't deliver the power from where it's being generated to where it's being consumed. You'll have other places on the grid where there are positive prices. You have urban centers that are paying substantial amounts of money for power. And if we could connect those two with transmission, this would all become a moot point. And so my emphasis has been much more on what are the sort of mechanisms or strategies that we need to make it feasible to build transmission, because it's very hard to build transmission in the United States.
Here's a question from Joe Bardenheyer. What are your thoughts on fuel cells for the generation of electricity and heat? For example, hydrogen conversion through SOFCs.
Yeah, so this is a good question, but I think probably one better for an engineer than an economist. This happens quite a lot in energy debates. We'll find ourselves sort of like playing baseball cards of like, who's your favorite technology, right? Like, who's going to be the one to win? And as an economist, I say, well, I don't know, but I would like to get the rules right in order to ensure that whoever it is who's the most economical producer is the one who ends up doing the producing. And so trying to ensure free and fair markets and competition among producers and these sorts of things are where I tend to spend my energy instead of really advocating for a specific technology.
Do you work at all interdisciplinary, have any interdisciplinary contacts with engineers? Is that part of your work style or your work partnerships?
Yeah, so I have a bit of work that is really in its infancy with some engineers from Argonne National Labs, where we've been trying to look at this issue of transmission, of sort of where transmission could be very helpful if we constrained ourselves to, say, upgrading the existing grid because we can't build new transmission lines, or only built transmission along existing rights of way because it's impossible to use eminent domain, or there are all kinds of obstacles to building in people's backyards. And so that has been mainly the setting in which I've engaged with engineers mostly.
Mm-hmm. Great. My friend Roger Borghesani has asked you to comment on Joe Biden's energy plan for 2035.
So I don't know too much about the energy plan, although I have come to understand that it's not the Green New Deal. I think that of what I'm familiar with, the focus on transmission is probably a good one, just in terms of, on one hand, there are jobs in building transmission lines. There are also jobs in building renewable sources of generation. These things are very complementary with one another. The more renewable sources of generation that you build, if you don't have transmission, there's going to be nowhere for that power to go. And so the need to build transmission, I think, is very complementary and an important part of really any energy plan going forward.
We have just 5 minutes left, and I'm going to get through another question or two. This one from CJ Volpone. Can you speak to the renewable energy credit system, how they influence the market, and when true generation cost of renewables will be directly compared to the cost of fossil fuel generation?
This is a great question. So for people who don't know, a renewable energy credit is a way for a utility to say achieve a goal of, say 20% renewable without themselves actually generating 20% of renewable energy themselves. They say it's cheaper for me to buy the credits from a producer who produces them themselves. And so I will sort of get the credits, they get the power, and that's how that typically works. I think this is a system that could work well, but it needs to be carefully implemented. The first way that it could be implemented very poorly would be integrating between different systems where you're including a place that doesn't have, say, a renewable portfolio standard or doesn't have goals for its utilities, but already uses a lot of renewable energy with a place that needs a lot of energy credits. You would effectively get, say, places in the Pacific Northwest or places with a lot of nuclear generation selling renewable energy credits, but it's for power that they would already be making anyway. And so really the goal of renewable energy credits is to put sort of an additional incentive for suppliers to build a power plant. You would like incremental renewable generation instead of, say, the same grid, but now I'm going to relabel that clean generation is my clean generation and then send my dirty generation over there. Really nothing changes. It's a labeling exercise. And then the second question was, I saw the first part was about renewable energy credits. Is there a second part to it?
How will they influence the market, and when the true generation cost of renewables will be directly compared to the cost of fossil fuel generation?
Yeah. So that second question is actually now. The cost for unsubsidized costs for wind generation, and solar is coming close, but I'm not sure it's quite there yet, is the most economical source of power that you can generate over the life cycle of the plant, if you include the fact that you have to buy fuel for a fossil-fired plant. If you include all of those life cycle costs, I think right now, according to Lazard's is a group that does a lot of these studies, wind is currently the lowest cost generator.
Great. It's great that there's so many more questions that have come in. It's unfortunate that we've run out of the time that we've been allocated. Steve, I want to thank you very much for joining us. This is really fascinating work. And to our alums and parents and friends around the world, we appreciate you joining us and submitting such thoughtful questions. You will receive an email in the next couple of days with a link to a brief survey, and we hope you'll complete that survey. To learn more about upcoming virtual programs that are hosted by the university, please visit alumniandfriends.tufts.edu. Have a wonderful rest of the day, and please be well, everybody. Thank you so much.